Welcome. You're listening to The Aligned Self, Conversations in Creating a Conscious and Abundant Life. This is Daniel Denovi. I'll be your guide and host. Let's see just where we can take this. Hello, friend, and welcome back to the conversation. This is part 3 of my 3-part series on the multiverse, parallel timelines, and probable selves. This episode has no real setup. It just picks up where we left off in the conversation in part 2. So, if you haven't yet listened to part 2, we suggest you go back there. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we suggest you go all the way back to the beginning to get the full breadth and depth of the entire subject. But if you're pressed for time and you need to start somewhere and you haven't listened to episode 2, start back there at episode 410, which is part 2 of this conversation. In recording these episodes, what I found interesting, for the first time ever, I've had multiple errors, dropouts, total distortions of the audio where I've had to go back in and insert certain words, certain phrases in order for it to make sense. So if every now and then you hear a little glitch, that's what that is. This episode picks up right after I told the story of how I jumped a timeline when I had that feeling of dread and I avoided death in a car accident. And I talked about having that conversation with Claire McNally and him talking about never ever having an accident and how that set me up to have the belief that it's possible to drive and not have an accident. You can drive safely and effectively all day long. And now, the rest of the story. But that conversation with Claire, are you sure you've never ever had an accident? Never even close? No, nothing. It created the possibility that it was true you could live without fear of an accident. Didn't have to be on the horizon, didn't have to be around the corner. You could literally drive and be safe wherever you go. I do that here at home. When they talk about tornadoes and hailstorms, we don't participate. I don't participate. I'm not participating in that. And I'll actually have a conversation with the spirit of the storm. But you can use it in other areas as well. I don't participate with poverty. I embrace abundance. Scarcity and abundance are core beliefs. Do you run your life running from scarcity, or do you run your life embracing abundance? Those are core beliefs. This was the other big lesson from that event where I shifted the timeline. I'm not participating in that reality. I don't have time for that. My wife was waiting in the wings. She was ready. She was waiting for me to show up. It was when I decided that I was no longer going to participate in old drama. I said I was ready for a partner. To be truthful, I said to myself, I'm too old to be playing these games anymore, so I'm not playing. Either I'm attracting a relationship that I can immerse myself in, or I don't want one. And she showed up a week later. She actually made a comment on one of my pictures on Facebook. And I responded back, and before you know it, we were in a conversation, and we then went out on a date. And from there, we've been together ever since. But essentially, I made a decision not to participate any longer in an old story. So let me quickly go over the framework of when I shifted my timeline with the accident. I acknowledged the core belief that was there. It's there. I'm no longer playing that game, no longer participating in that idea. My new story is like I reject that story, depending on how vehemently you have to do it. Use the energy that makes it possible for you. Everyone's a little bit different. If it's something strong, you're going to have to really push it aside. But you acknowledge that it's there. I used to believe this. I used to believe it. We don't say, I don't believe it anymore. I used to believe it. So you want to acknowledge it's there and then push it aside and replace it with your new story. My new story is this. And I told it in a way where it was believable to me. I could have said, there's no way that we're going to have an experience. But I had a feeling something was going to happen. And how would I know, really, what was going to happen? What did I avoid if I didn't have a close call? Now, I said in the first episode, as a psychic, I can do a reading on your probable future. And I usually preface it that these are signs of probable realities. You have the ability to shift it and change it at any point in time. Depending on how much momentum has been built up based on the beliefs and actions that you've been taking, we build momentum over time. And so in some ways, our probable future is almost impossible to corrupt or to shift. Have you ever seen those old westerns and the team of horses? You got 6 horses out front pulling the stagecoach, and somehow the horses get loose and the horses are a runaway. Well, stopping those horses is almost the same as stopping a probable future that is well in motion. It's not impossible, but it can be difficult. Requires some attention. Now, I spend an hour and a half of focused attention in shifting and creating a new story. Well, to be completely accurate, during that hour and a half, I did have stops that I was making. So I'd deliver a package and I'd get back in my truck and drive to the next one. And while I was in my truck, I would go through that whole motion, rejecting my old belief, rejecting the story that was about to happen, and then bringing in my new story. And then I would stop and deliver another package, and then I'd be back at it. Most people are rather cavalier about creating a new intention, or it's just like, oh, this is what I would like. I want this. Now, really focus on it. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? Hit all the senses. Tell the story the way you want it to be, where it really feels good. Neville Goddard said this: assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Tell the story how you really want it to be, while acknowledging what was created in the past. That is the past. Now, this is my new story. This is my new commitment. This is what I'm focusing on. This is what I'm creating. In fact, this is already done. Essentially, what I was doing was a scripting technique. I scripted and spoke into existence a new reality. So you, whether you consider yourself psychic or not, can essentially take your core beliefs right now, your activities, your behaviors, and there is a predictable future that you're going to step into in a year from now or 2 years from now. You might not have all the details, but you have a pretty good idea. If something doesn't change, it's pretty much going to be just the way the last year had gone or the previous 2 years, how those had gone. If you don't do anything specifically different, you just create more of the same. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. So there are some changes, some shifts you need to make. And more than likely, you know what the shifts have to be. Would you be interested in a journaling technique or a letter writing technique that will shift your timeline, shift your reality? You would? Okay, here it is. One is the 30-day or 90-day letter. Essentially, you write a letter from yourself 30 days, 90 days in the future, saying how proud you are of yourself, the shifts that you've been able to make, that you remember when 30 days ago or 90 days ago, things were a particular way. Maybe you were facing a mountain of bills, but now everything's taken care of. Unexpected money came in. You have a whole new focus on your health, and you're just so proud of the shifts that you've been able to make. Really feel that shifts. Really feel that future as if you are proud of yourself. Feel the shifts. Think of the shifts. See them in your mind's eye. What would you hear? You see, this is essentially a journal entry from a future self. And I want you to be proud of yourself so you have that internal sense of satisfaction. It's not validated by outside sources. It's validated by inside sources. Who are you being? Who have you been? Who are you now? As you write in your letter or your journal entry, you should be proud of yourself for the shifts and changes that you've been able to make. As I remember back 30 days ago, 90 days ago, it was not likely that I would arrive at this place. In fact, I could not specifically draw you the line that got me from here to there. Through a series of synchronicities and divine intervention, I got really lucky. Things kind of fell into place. I had breakthroughs that I didn't know I was going to have. You see, we're very non-specific about exactly what happened, but we want to be specific about where we ended up. Now, you might spend an hour or so writing this letter, really getting into it from your future perspective. And then you read the letter periodically, maybe twice a week, 3 times a week. Don't do it too much. If you feel like you have to read it every day to really make it solid in your experience, then that activity is backed by fear that it won't happen. But if it's just now and then, just to remind yourself of where you've been the previous 90 days, and you can use it as validation, as a pat on the back. Feel proud about the progress that you've made. Now, what's important about this is that it feels somewhat believable. somewhat achievable. Not that we can't do the impossible, but if it feels like it's within the realm of possibility and probability, then you can believe that it can happen. And anything that you can conceive of and believe, you can achieve. It will happen. So let's say in your mind, you think you need a greater time horizon, a longer time horizon. So you can plan out 6 months or a year out. Now, this is an interesting diary exercise. Write it like a journal entry, a day in the life of. 6 months out, this is my day. If you're currently working in a job that you don't particularly care for, then if you write from the perspective of 6 months out, you can say, I'm really beginning to see the light in the tunnel. I think in another month or two, I'll be able to leave my job. Things have been falling into place. I'm really excited about the new possibilities. It seems like every day a new opportunity arises. Then you can write another journal entry 10 months out or a year out. I left my job. There's such a sense of freedom and possibility. I've started my own business and I already have clients on board. I've made money from day one. Or, you got another job or whatever it is, it's exciting, it's new, it's fresh. There's a sense of freedom, a sense of possibility. It seems like the sky's the limit. Everything's coming up roses. You get the idea. But write it like a journal entry from a day in the life of. And to break things up, you can do it 3 months out, 90 days out, and not necessarily 30 or 90 days to the day. Break it up a little bit. Like I used to set my alarm at 7:07 in the morning when I used an alarm because it was unique and I knew when I saw 7:07, it meant to get up. I no longer need an alarm, but that worked for me. And so rather than 30 days out, pick 35 days out and then 68 days out and then 92 days out. Vary it up so it's not so predictable and it seems more like a day in the life of, and you're not making it up. And all through this, make sure that you're assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled. What does it feel like to have what you want? What does it open up? What are the possibilities? A sense of freedom. Really feel all those feelings. That way you're aligning your vibration with this new timeline. And if you don't feel like you're a writer, it doesn't have to be a novel. It doesn't have to be like a Pulitzer Prize. It can just be a paragraph. As long as you connect with the feeling of it, and if you're a talker, you can talk into a recorder, a voice recorder on your phone or something like that, and just talk about how excited you are about being where you are. And if you have trouble getting over where you are today or where you were, it seems really real and you can't acknowledge that. Acknowledge that in your letter. Acknowledge it in your diary. I can remember back 30 days ago, I felt like I had the weight of the world on my shoulder. It was unperceivable or unpredictable given how I felt then where I would be today. But I can remember dreaming of this moment, dreaming of this feeling. It's so fulfilling to feel this today, to know where I was and where I've come. I'm so proud of myself for the progress I've made. So let's say that you shift your timeline. What happens to the people in your life? Now, your relationships will change, or they may stay somewhat the same, depending on their reality. You see, you're just rubbing shoulders up against each other. You have agreed to have a shared experience, but maybe the shift that you've made doesn't necessarily include them anymore, or they are now vibrating at a different level. Maybe they've made a core decision in their life, and they're being different. You may find that they drift away, and then you'll come back from time to time in your experience, or you may drift and go in completely different directions. It depends on how much of a vibrational match they are in staying in your life, how much of a vibrational match you are for their life. Now, earlier I said you may be on your own timeline, your own story arc, and there are commonalities or intersection points that we're going to experience as a group. But even though we have these common occurrences, common events, say 9/11, just recently, Donald Trump had an assassination attempt, at least in this timeline, the timeline I'm in, and he avoided injury, serious injury, that is. What's interesting, it was a narrow escape, similar to my event where the car came out right behind my vehicle and spun around in the highway. We just missed each other. So potentially in another timeline, he was actually bought the bullet, or he decided never ever to run. See, there's all these different possibilities, but we have a common experience. If you and I are rubbing shoulders and we have a common experience, then we have agreed at some level, on a tacitly, on an other than conscious level, say a higher self level, to have a similar experience, to encounter or be part of a grander, bigger story. This is the unfolding of human consciousness and why we find ourselves in these tumultuous times at this point in our lives. But like I said earlier, even though we're having these common experiences, these common events, you don't have to participate. We said that about COVID. We're not participating. We're not buying into this. To be truthful and completely accurate, we did get sick early on, at the end of February, 1st of March, but we got over it. We had been somewhat faithful listeners. We would check in every day with the Today Show. We would find it entertaining. But increasingly, it felt like they were fear-mongering, telling lies. Now, I can't vouch for everything that they said, but there was a press release in May where the CDC said that they were going to change how they were counting the COVID cases. Before this, everyone that had died in the hospital were considered to have COVID. People traditionally die in the hospitals all the time. But when they began counting the COVID cases, if you died in a care facility, you were considered to have died from COVID, whether it could have been attributed to something else or not. They said that they were attempting to manage an unmanageable situation. But then in May, they made an announcement that if you were admitted to the hospital, they were going to consider you a COVID case. Just being admitted to a care facility, you were considered to have COVID. I believe that was May 19th. On May 20th, the next day, on the news, the headlines were, "Single greatest rise in new COVID cases." Well, they were accounting differently. They didn't say that. They just said the single greatest rise in one day of COVID cases. That's when we knew the news was completely lying to us. They were fear-mongering. They weren't really giving us the truth. And so we made a decision that day to stop watching the news. And we haven't since. We haven't participated in that narrative. Now, people have gotten sick all around us in varying degrees, but we have not. We've been really healthy. We've also taken the steps to maintain our immunity and be healthy. We're in a different conversation and have been. Now, that might seem like old news given how things have progressed, but that's where we were at the time. I say that because you don't have to play into the mass narrative, the societal narrative. You can choose not to participate. You can go along and invest yourself in your own timeline. In the words of Mr. Miyagi, the best way to avoid a punch is to not be there on the receiving end. Now let's talk about the Mandela effect, because it's all kind of tied into these when people are shifting timelines. Now, the Mandela effect is named after Nelson Mandela. I guess there's a lot of people that remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison. Well, in my reality, he did not die. He was let go from prison after 27 years of imprisonment. He was released and became the president of South Africa. Won the Nobel Peace Prize. It was a whole different narrative. But there was this group of people that remembered him dying. Hence the Mandela effect, where people remember events happening one way, but when you look at the news, when you hear other people talk about it, they have a different accounting of it. Now, this reference may be too old for some of you. Ed McMahon was the host or the MC of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Well, he was a spokesman, from my recollection, for Publishers Clearinghouse, because I remember signing up for magazines. Essentially, it was a magazine subscription service. You got access to a bunch of trial subscriptions or reduced rate subscriptions for magazines from Publishers Clearinghouse. I never ever heard of the American Family Publishers. I remember getting the envelopes with Ed McMahon's picture on it, Publishers Clearinghouse. That's the only company I dealt with when I was younger. But according to general populace, actually Publishers Clearinghouse as well, Ed McMahon never worked for the company. Everything that you read about today says that he worked for American Family Publishers. Yet, I was able to find a YouTube video from The Tonight Show where Johnny Carson talks about him working for Publishers Clearinghouse. Seth, the group consciousness that Jane Roberts channeled, said that sometimes when we jump realities, we'll create something and it will be forever in our experience. Let's say that you create a quote or a phrase from a book, something that really changes your life. Even though it might not have originally been written in that book, it will now appear in that book and every book after. So evidently, this has been occurring for millennia. Shifts in experience, shift in reality, shift in history. Now, because we're such a global society now and we have mass communication, I think these variances in recollection are occurring because different people are on different timelines. And if you truly remember things differently than the way they're occurring, then you are on a timeline that's not participating with global consciousness necessarily. Because remember, what you recollect and where you currently are is just one of many possible probable realities. Now, I want to talk a little bit about probable selves and being able to recreate yourself. Earlier, I talked about your idealized self, your ideal self. Well, if you can imagine it, you can achieve it, if you can believe it. So part of my process in the Aligned Self, I have an Aligned Self coaching program, is identifying your values, your highest priorities of life, and defining them in such a way where they become your core belief system, the organizing principles for your life. And it's not necessarily what you currently value today, but the values of the person that you want to be. And then what are the rules that you live your life by? What are the beliefs that support your values? What's the mission for your life? We basically craft an entire schema or an organizing concept of who you are. We organize it consciously. Remember, who you know yourself to be, for the most part, is a haphazard construction, kind of pieced together by different assumptions, different perceptions, different expectations over time that you've adapted for better or worse. Very few of us have chosen who we want to be. When I did this for myself when I was 27, it shifted everything, shifted my timeline, I feel. Because within a year, I changed locations, I changed my job, elements of my job shifted, my marriage dissolved, faded away. I entered on a whole new fast-track journey. And when I think back to that moment, that decision point, when I realized if I continued the way I was, there was a predictable, almost certain future that I did not want to live into. And so I needed to create a revolution for my life. Now, beware, and I've said this before, and I continue to say it, beware of the power of a declaration. When you declare that something is going to shift, something is going to change, there is power and intensity behind such a declaration. It is like a fire that burns clean. It burns everything down in its path. So if you hold anything sacred in your life, you want to make sure that you refer to that when you create your new story. I want to maintain this aspect of my life, enhance it, make it even better. But sometimes in order to become the person that you were meant to be, you need to leave the person of who you are behind. But I don't believe in leaving yourself behind. You want to be gentle with yourself. You don't want to reject who you are, who you were. It's gotten to you to this point. There is a certain amount of self-love that is valuable and will carry you forward faster. But you can truly become the person that you are meant to be. Now, at this point, if you've been following me, there's very little that is actually of substance in your life that can't be shifted, can't be changed. The Hindus have a concept called Maya, M-A-Y-A. And Maya is the grand illusion, the play of consciousness. It is essentially the sensation and the experience of being in the physical world. But it suggests that there is a greater reality beyond this play of consciousness. And it happens to be a personal belief of mine. Now, I also admit or know that I had a transpersonal experience when I was 28. I left my body 4 times, and I had the distinct knowing, I left that experience having the distinct knowing that I was not my body, that I was so much more, that I was a spiritual being immersed in the human experience. I just had a palpable knowing. For many people, it's merely an understanding. This is also an experience or a conclusion that people come to that have lived through a near-death experience. They know themselves to be so much more. They have a palpable experience of being connected with all that is, to having access to unconditional love. And because there's this realization that this is just a play of consciousness, sometimes there's a little apathy that creeps in that this is not real, that the day-to-day life is not real. And I'm confronted with that from time to time. But then I come full circle and realize I chose to be here, to be in the experience, to immerse myself in the experience. So in order for me to really have the adventure that I'm here to have, then I need to immerse myself fully in the present moment to get the full value out of this moment. One other thing that you can do to shift a timeline is simply play with it. Work with your higher self, work with your greater consciousness, and say, I want to experience a shift in a timeline. I did this just a couple weeks ago. Your consciousness can go anywhere you send it. So, rather than engineer or orchestrate which timeline you go to, leave it up to your higher self. Just say that I want an experience that is in alignment with the most benevolent outcome for all concerned. My friend Tom T. Moore popularized the MBO, the most benevolent outcome, so I think that's a good invocation. No matter what you intend, no matter what you create, put the tag on the most benevolent outcome for all concerned. That way you leave the management up to the management and not to the janitor. All the details, all the synchronicities can be carried out by a greater vision. Well, I think this 3-part series was significant. I think you'll find value in it. If not, this isn't your cup of tea. I'm probably not your cup of tea. So do yourself a favor and find a timeline that is most appropriate for you. Until next time, this is your friend and host, Daniel Danovi, urging you to follow your bliss. Live your life from inner signals. Be inner directed as you engage in the epic adventure.